going to do a little bit of magic with some Unreal Engine 5 renders. So I have this scene that I worked on with some of my favorite clients over at Stoneblade Entertainment. We made their shard explode for the Shards of Infinity Kickstarter campaign. And I have a scene here where the shard spins, we get some particles and explosions and swirls, and then eventually the particle explodes or the shard explodes. So, long story short, the way I did this originally is I did all the color grading and post effects in After Effects. And a general rule of thumb for pre-rendered content, such as something like this for a Kickstarter video, I would never ever bake the color grade down in Unreal Engine. I don't like the tools out of the post-process volume. They work, but they're not as refined as some of the things that you can do in After Effects and DaVinci. But let me just show you what's up. So in this scene, you have the post-process volume, and I have a very simple lighting setup of a directional light, basically moving around the scene, but we're not concerned about the lighting right now. We just want to get this to be as looking good as possible. So let's start with an empty slate, and generally speaking, I will control the exposure of my scene using the exposure in the post-process volume. After that, the only things I would ever consider touching in the post-process volume would be the bloom and the lens flares. And now, the issue that I have with the bloom is that while it does give us a little bit of glow, it, to me, doesn't have the same natural look as a camera. And post-rendered tools like After Effects and DaVinci Resolve, they end up having better looks for some of these glows. But if I were to try and get this straight out of Engine without any other effects after I render this, I would do it like this. I'd go into my bloom setting of the convolution, and I'd set this to whatever value I think looks good. I would go down to my lens flare, and I would bring this up to a point in which it works. Now, the reason why it's not showing anything is the bokeh size is set to 0 if I bring this up. And this is exactly why I don't like using the post-process volume in Unreal Engine. The issue is that we're getting these weird artifacts just flying all over. Like, it's a lens flare, but it's making a lens flare for every single bright object in the scene. And to me, that's not helpful because now it just looks busy and gross. Like I said, we're going to try and get this to look as good as we can. So I'd maybe add some vignette right here, and I'd really just crank this up. I'd maybe go to the color grading tab. I'd go to the global, go to the contrast, and maybe pump this up a little bit. I'm definitely going to turn off this lens flare because it's just a lot right now. Maybe if I crank this up to a super high value and then bring the intensity down to like 0.5. Now, to me, it kind of looks better, but the issue is that as we go through this animation, it's still going to look like a police siren, sort of like brushing across the screen. And for me to fuss with this more, it would just take me too long, and I know the tools in After Effects and DaVinci are just better. So my post-process volume settings for almost every scene that I do is I will set the lens flare to 0, the bokeh size to 0. I will basically turn off everything so that I can control all of that in post. The biggest key with this is that whatever you see in your camera is what you get, and we're going to make it look better in After Effects or DaVinci Resolve. So let's dive over into After Effects now and see what we can do to make this shot look better. All right, so we're in After Effects now, and I'm just going to play the reference that we did for the actual client project. And I will say that we're doing a lot of extra effects on top of that to create the transition and do some extra crypto mats. And I'm assuming that if you're watching this, we're just getting started with learning how to use Unreal and color grading. So right now, I just want us to think about the basics. So with that, we have our scene, and if we play it back, it looks just like we had in Engine, rendering it out in 4K. So I will say it does look a little better as far as I'm concerned. And with that in mind, we're going to add some glows. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to add a default After Effects glow. Not flow, glow. We're going to go to glow right here, stylize glow, and drop this on. Now, I will say, as a professional motion graphics artist, there will be a point in which you realize some of the native tools in After Effects are not the best. Now, I'm not a big fan of tutorials that use plugins, but just hear me out when I say that sometimes when you're making content, let's say you're making art and you have to go to Michael's and buy some paint canvases, sometimes those paid plugins are just like buying some extra brushes or something like that. So I'm not saying go out and buy any of these plugins, but they will get you to the end destination faster. You can use all of the After Effects native tools and get a perfectly fine and similar result. It just takes more steps. And the reason why I say that is this glow out of the box, the After Effects native glow, looks terrible. And what I would want to do to really push this is play with these settings, the threshold, the radius, and the intensity until I got to a point where I'm happy. And it's just going to be hard to find that point because we need to pull these numbers into all different directions and find a really subtle look. And really, it just comes down to stacking effects. So we take this glow, and we have this base glow right here, and I'm actually going to bring down the intensity to 0.05. And then I'm going to bring down the radius even more. So it's really going to add a little bit of highlight and halation around the brightest parts of my image. And that's what this threshold is doing. It's creating a little bit of glow around the brightest parts only. If I were to set this to like closer to 0, it's going to start pulling more of the image into the glow. And if I set this to 100%, it's just going to do weird things. So from here, then I would duplicate this glow and make an even bigger radius and find a nice number that I like. Now, I did realize I did a bit of a boo-boo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Control-Alt-Y on my keyboard. And this is how I'm going to start stacking effects. So I'll call this adjustment layer glows. And then I'm going to go into my shard animation, take these glows, and drop it onto that adjustment layer. So now we just have the clip under our scene. So if I want to make this look better, I want to add a little bit of color correction to this as well. So I'm going to do that before all of my glows so that we're only getting the brightest parts of our image. So we're going to hit Control-Alt-Y again. We'll call this CC, color correction. And then we're going to add a lumetri color and drop this on like so. And then we're going to add a little bit of an S-curve and really start getting a more contrasty look. What I like about the lumetri color tool, while it is native to After Effects, is there's also a vignette, so we can just go in and add that same vignette. And I realize it's going one way. We need to go to the negative direction. Now we're talking. So now we're getting a much more intense looking image with the lumetri color and the glows. And after we get the vignette, I'd say that this looks a little bit more punchy, a little bit more contrasty. It looks more visually interesting. And with these native After Effects glows, I'm actually pretty happy with this, just straight out of the box. Because now we can just go in and adjust these glows how we need. And the reason why I think it looks better now is because the way the color correction, this contrast is helping our image. It's bringing down the darkest parts of our image and it's bringing up the brightest parts. So then the glows are only going to be affecting the brightest parts of my image. So I'd say that this looks better. But I'm going to use some plugins now, and we're going to try and get an even better result. So just like the last scene, now we're going to use some plugins to help get the final look that we want. Before we do that, I should mention I'm not sponsored by any of these plugins, and sometimes some of them work better than others. These are just what I like to use on occasion. So the first one, I'll go back and I'll use the Lumetri Color tool. When I add the Lumetri Color, it's the same thing. I'm going to add a little bit of an S-curve to create some contrast in the scene, make the darker parts darker, make the brighter parts brighter. I'm also going to adjust this a little bit, add a little bit of sharpening, not too much, just a little bit to make it a little bit sharper. It just crisps those edges just a little bit. Now we're going to blur that in a second, but we're going to add that vignette that I did earlier, bring the amount down, and that looks good. There's two glows that I will generally either use from a plugin standpoint. There's either deep glow or optical glow. Optical glow will end up being slower, but it looks real nice. Then there's deep glow. It doesn't look quite as good as optical glow, but it's faster, so pick your poison. I'm going to use deep glow for this one, and you can find this plugin on aescripts.com. I think it's like $50. Again, I'm not sponsored, but the reason why I like any of these plugins like optical glow or deep glow is that we have this tool called the input, and we can bring the threshold up, and it's a much more calculated, precise way to only affect the brightest parts of our image. So we have our deep glow 1, and we can go in and scrub through and find a frame where it's like real big, and we can see that there's some weird artifacts happening. That actually might be because of the sharpness. Yes, it was. So we'll set that to like 1. No, you know what? We're not even going to add any sharpness. That's okay. That's what color grading is like. It's pushing and pulling to get a nice looking image. So we don't like the sharpness there, but now these glows are looking, to me, they're fall off, as in the gradation between the brightest part and the darkest part looks a lot more natural. And we can adjust that with the radius very conveniently right here. So I'm going to bring this down, 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 even more, and then, no, not 0, just a little bit. So it's that first initial glow, and then with that glow, I'm going to duplicate that, and I'm going to bring the radius way up, and then bring the exposure down to like 0.2. And to me, that could be a passing image. Now, I do think that the exposure of the glow is really bright still. So I'm going to bring the first glow exposure down so it's not quite as intense. And I'd say that's looking pretty solid to start. And if I were to play that back, granted, when we cake on these effects, it will slow down our RAM preview, so just bear in mind that when you do VFX stuff like this, it will be slower. But I'd say that this looks okay for this tutorial. The last thing I always love to add to all of my renders is light rays. Now, very conveniently, Red Giant has a very awesome tool called Shine that I use all the time. And if you look at the reference video, that is the plugin I use to create a lot of those light rays coming towards the scene. I like this plugin because we can go into the pre-process tool right here and we can adjust the threshold, and a value of 255 will be 0, as in it's not going to really do much because it's only going to affect just the white parts, like the pure whites, versus if we go just below that, it's going to catch anything that is close to white, but not all the way. And I can just keep pulling this until I find a value that I like. Now, the issue with this is that there's this color cast that is not really reminiscent of what the image should look like. So I'm going to go into the colorize tool and set that to none. And now it's going to really be based on the main image. Now we're getting these light rays throughout everything. They are a little heavy in some sections, so we're just going to bring down the length just a little bit, maybe boost the light, and adjust the threshold just a little bit. Now, it is affecting a large portion of the image, and we don't want that. And very conveniently, there's this Use Mask tool. So we can just click that, and now we have a mask. It is going to give us a circular mask directly in the center, and we can just increase the radius of that to the point in which we want those light rays, and then we can feather it out by a lot. So now we're getting this cool looking scene. And after a little bit of fussing, this is what I came up with. Now, my issue with this is that while I was working in After Effects, it's slow and it's chugs. It's hard to work with. And for this tutorial, this is a good example of how I would approach creating some cool looking VFX style stuff with some plugins. Granted, you could use the native AE tools and get a pretty awesome looking result as well, but some of the tools might either take you longer to get to the end result that the plugins would get, or it just might not look as good because some of the tools are just not built for certain things. My issue, like I said though, is it's slow and it takes a long time to RAM preview, and I would have to either look at this in quarter res, and in quarter res it's actually pretty legit and we get this cool looking effect based on the brightest parts of the image. Now, if I were to make this a real client deliverable, I would go in and animate a lot of these values, like the length, the post-process, the pre-process, etc., to get the look that I'm going for. But I have to look at this in quarter res, and it's just going to take forever. So the last thing I'm going to show you is doing this in DaVinci Resolve. Same tips, tools, tricks, etc. So we're in DaVinci Resolve now, and I have the scene, and if we play it back, it's going to look just the same. And the first thing I'm going to do is that same thing. We're going to add that S curve at the beginning, maybe add a little bit of vignette, and just add a little bit of color correction to this overall scene. And just brighten up the brightest parts. And let's just see what that's looking like. Sure, that looks fine. Yeah, I'd say that looks pretty good. We're getting a little hot on the highlights and the particles, which is what we want, because then we'll be able to control some of the glows very shortly. Let's add that vignette now. So I'll hold Alt and S on my keyboard to make a new node. And then what I'll do is I'll go into my masking tool down here, add a mask, shape it up to the size of my composition. I'll bring down the highlights exclusively by a good amount, and then I'll just hit the invert on that. So now if we hit Control D, we can just see what that vignette is doing. Turn off our mask viewer. Yeah, cool. So now we have a good color correction base. We can call this color correction, and then vignette. And if you don't know how to rename a node in DaVinci, you just select the node and then hit the tab key on your keyboard. So now we're ready to add some of the fun stuff. We'll add a glow, drop this on, and now we're getting a little bit of glow if we turn that off and on. But I want to affect more of the image. And I'm going to bring down the spread so it's just hitting the brightest parts, like so. And then maybe adjust a little bit of these options. Now I'm going to actually change the color of the glow. So we're getting a little bit of blue in there. Sure, that looks pretty good. Then from here, we're going to add another glow, basically duplicating that. So let's just add that in. And I like to stay organized like this. You can do any way you want. So I have my color correction here, I have my vignette, and then I have my two glows. And then I'm actually going to increase the shine threshold on this one and just really fuss with that a little bit more. And I can actually change the aspect ratio of it so it's a little bit more wider rather than horizontal. So we get a cool looking like anamorphic lens kind of effect. Again, this is all up to personal preference, and when you do these things, it's really just like we need to make sure that it looks cool, it's optimized for our scene so that we can actually art direct it. And yeah, I realize we're getting a little bit of like warpy waviness with the horizontal, so we're just actually gonna reset that. I'd say that looks pretty good. And what I love about DaVinci Resolve is that we're getting a full real-time playback in DaVinci with all of these glows. Versus if I were to jump over to After Effects and even using the native After Effects tools, we are chugging. And I am on a 3090, two 3090s with the GPU enabled. So I don't know what to say about that, but Back to DaVinci. So we have our glows here. They're playing in real time. The last thing I'm going to add is those light rays effects that we were adding in After Effects. So we'll hit Alt-S to make a new node right here, and then we'll switch over to our power window, which will give us our mask tools. We'll just add a mask, and we can see here that there's the mask right there. It's on that node, and if we were to make it brighter or darker, we can see what the mask is affecting. And I really just want it to hit the very center of our effects right there, and I'll drag the light rays directly on that. Now the light rays are pointing down because it says that the light source is coming from the very top, but I want this to come from the very center. So 0.5 and 0.5 on the X and Y is going to be the very dead center of the frame. And then we can just go in and start adjusting the threshold. And now if we bring the threshold up, it's going to hit the brightest parts of our image. So maybe we'll set that to like right there, like almost at 1 or just at 1. Bring up the length. And then we can maybe bring down the softness so it looks a little bit sharper. And then just get a cool looking effect that we like. Maybe add a little bit of blue to it again. And if we play it back, hey look, it's playing back in real time. We can get a very interesting look. I could fuss with this more, but my point behind sharing this video is that there's many ways to design something and do a VFX thing, and what you feed After Effects or DaVinci Resolve will really affect the look. We'll talk about how to create some of the swirling effects in another tutorial, but I hope this gives you an idea of the tools that you can use to color grade a VFX shot using either After Effects or DaVinci Resolve, or you could do it in Unreal if you really need to. I will leave it there. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something. If you did, let me know in the comment section down below. If you have questions, comments, concerns, whatever else, comment section is down there for that as well. And I will leave you with the final tip, and that is to eat 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, and you'll make some. Goodbye, my friends. Bye.